I started in my first church at the age of 18, and I think I started functioning almost intuitively as a church planner without knowing anything about what I was doing. I was assigned to an inner city church that was dying. Like I said, I was 18 years old in college. Just started walking the streets, getting to meet people, inviting them to come to be part of our community of faith. I just figured that's what you did. So every church that I served since then was all about community engagement and about who was outside the walls of the church and how do we make relational connections with them, with the church and with Christ. So it was, many, many years later, it was in 1999, when I really sensed a very strong calling to plant a new church. I was serving as a consultant. I'd stepped out of the local church and was appointed beyond the local church. And we built a house in a nice neighborhood in western Pennsylvania and started meeting a lot of unchurched people our age with young kids. And they knew that I used to be a pastor, and they started asking questions, very spiritual, very deep questions, and they were all detached. And I remember one dinner session that we had, sitting around with a glass of wine, the one person said, "Have you ever thought about starting a church for people like us?" And I went, "Well, yeah, I have." And so I went to the bishop and said, "I believe God is calling me to do this." It wasn't the conference's idea. He said, "Well, we don't do things like that in United Methodism." And he had me meet with the cabinet. The cabinet said, "Well, we don't do things like that in United Methodism." And I said, "Well, not to be brass, but I feel God's calling me to plant a church, and I'm going to do it. The question is whether you want it to be United Methodist or not." And they went, "Well, that's," I forget the word that he used, but pretty brave and courageous. And at that point, they weren't going to give me any money, and they figured they had absolutely nothing to lose. And they said, "Go ahead and try it, and we'll see what happens." And we ended up planting a church that grew to about 300 people. And then I got tagged to go down to Central Florida to help a large membership church start a new church in a growing community. And that was then my second church plant from 2000 to about 2005. And then I got picked up by Path One to kind of be the director of our national movement in church planting. So it's been a part of my journey now, at least for the last decade or more.
Well, when I first got started, I owned a marketing and business development firm for 16 years, and one of the specialties that we did in that was we started new businesses. Mm-hmm. So this was kind of a natural thing. That's everything from writing a business plan to putting the team together, developing the concept, casting the vision, procuring the venture capital money to fund you, all those kind of things was what I had done on a number of occasions in my past life. Stepping into the church, I'd always worked in youth ministry, so I'd been working as a part-time youth pastor, wrestling with the call, and once I got involved on track for ordained ministry, my first appointment was to a new church plant as an associate pastor. So I was on the ground floor of that opportunity, helping determine where the church was going to be planted in the area of Mooresville, and helping cast a vision, putting together the launch plan, all those kind of things. And so I guess, in all of that, if I felt like I was doing what I was called to do, I certainly believed that God had reconciled or brought together the past experiences into, what I was doing at the present time. And that just kind of, everything kind of just developed from there as far as new opportunities.
And so I had just actually begun the process of transitioning from deacon to elder and looking into a full MDiv. I had a master's in education, so I didn't have a MDiv. And then Rob Fuquay, who's down in different annual conference, moved to Williamson's Chapel, and we were pursuing what my call was, because Williamson's Chapel grew. When I moved there 11 years ago now, it was a very small church, or mid-size. It grew from like 450 to 500 on Sunday morning to about 1,200 under the leadership of Terry Moore. And then when Rob came, it continued to grow. So it grew very quickly, and this area grew. And my call grew, or changed, rather. And so when Rob came, I was doing music and pastoral care and United Methodist Women and small groups, and pretty much had my hand in a lot of different areas in the church. And he and I believed that it was time to refine what I did. I had my evaluation with the DS, and I'd never had one before because they didn't evaluate deacons, And so in there she said, I have one question for you. And I figured it would be, where's your paperwork? Because I'm notoriously late on my paperwork. And so she said, I just have one question for you. And I said, okay. And she said, have you ever thought about being a church planter? And I said, well, no, not really. I mean, we've talked about what could revitalization look like in some area churches, because Williamson's Chapel is a strong church, etc. And he said, or she said, well, we have talked about it, and we have the bishop's initiatives, and we would like for you to look into and prayerfully discern becoming a church planter. And I said, oh, well, all right, and so I left that and I called Rob immediately. I'm like, you're not gonna believe this, but they actually want us to look into that. And so he was excited about it, and that began the process. We went to something that the bishop and the director of congregational development had, and took leadership from Williamson's Chapel. We had a vision team that had just been formed, so we were looking into that, and that's what gave birth to it.
For several years, I had really thought about what it would look like to start a new church or to be a part of a new campus or satellite for a larger church. And I never really felt like God was actually calling me to that specifically, but it was always an idea I had. And I always left it kind of up to God for Him to present an opportunity, if ever there would be, that it would be pretty obvious. And one day, Matthews United Methodist, the leadership here, gave me a call and said, we've got this idea, this vision for a new venue, for a new community of faith here, and we'd like to talk to you about possibly coming and leading that. So originally I said no, because where I was serving currently, things were going really well. And eventually, over a couple of weeks of some pretty difficult discernment, my wife and I decided that it'd be a good idea, and this would be a lot closer to the dream that we had for ministry in the long run.
Oftentimes, when I'm assessing potential planters, I'll hear stories of when they were in high school or college, or when they were young kids, where they just had this ability to gather a group of people around something. Whether it was a bicycle club, or whether it was some kind of a drama club in school, or, for me, when I was very, very young, living outside of Philadelphia, I gathered a group of people, my friends, together, and we made little trinkets and things that we sold for muscular dystrophy. Jerry's Kids, Jerry Lowe's Telethon was a big deal back then. And I was the ringleader and just said, I think we can do this. And we sold we made $1,000. We got on TV. It was that kind of thing. And I was always looking for the next thing. And oftentimes I'll meet planters, and they can very quickly articulate. I was the startup person in one capacity or another, and had a way of kind of pulling people into that and organizing it and growing it from there. So, I listen for stories like that when I'm talking to church planners. Tell me about a time when you did this, and tell me about another time. Somebody says that they really have a passion for reaching the unchurched. One of the questions that I would ask is, when was the last time you had an unchurched person sitting at your table for dinner? And oftentimes they can answer that and then just ask, tell me about another time. When you have somebody who kind of gives you the deer in the headlights look, like, oh, I've never done that. Well, tell me about the last time you spoke with somebody who's unchurched. Well, I haven't yet. Okay, well, I'm not sure that you're really demonstrating something that you're going to be able to do if you're not already doing it. Those kinds of things you can't help but do, whether you're planning a church or not.
You got to have an entrepreneurial spirit. You've got to be a strong leader. You've got to be very confident in what you're called to do. You've got to be able to cast vision. You've got to be able to develop leaders. That means letting go of things yourself and giving other people an opportunity to embrace moving forward and taking responsibility on their own, taking ownership. You also have got to quickly make friends with failure. Success doesn't come just right off the bat. I mean, you've got to work through things that are not going to go well, and be able to take a step back, assess the circumstances, and move on. So failure is something that you're going to experience on probably a daily basis. So you've got to be a strong leader. You've got to have a lot of confidence, entrepreneurial spirit. Those are the things that come to mind. But then you have to have certainly a strong understanding of what it means to share the gospel message.
But as far as passions and skills go, I could probably name three that are pretty vital. One, I would say, is just an evangelical urgency, just a deep passion to reach people with the message and hope of Jesus Christ, to know that there are people out there in a broken and a hurting world that are just looking for hope, and to know that we kind of have that hope and to be able to offer it and to be used by God in that way. That would be the number one passion. The other thing would just be a commitment to a vision, to be so certain and confident in a particular vision for what it might look like to start a new community of faith. And third is just kind of an entrepreneurial spirit. Just as you look around, you kind of have ideas to do things differently, to do things maybe a little bit more effectively for the sake of a particular context or culture.
And when I assess potential planters, one of the things that I look for is behavior that we can identify in their past that will affect their present and their future. Past behavior predicts future behavior, kind of a thing. So I really do think, we can look back on our past to say, did we have kind of a brassness, this desire to start something new, to be engaged with the community, not take no for an answer. Those kinds of things are what we're looking for. I think it takes a tremendous amount of faith, belief in God, because you get tested like no other place.
I think you have to be passionate, and you need to live, breathe, and die by the mission to reach people and offer them Christ. Wesley said, offer them Christ.
And if you have a passion for reaching people for Jesus Christ, then you're certainly not going to be going around beating people over the head with the Bible, but you have to be willing to get out in the ground in the areas and the communities that you're called to serve and really understand the language that people are speaking. We're not in the attraction business anymore, so anytime you put anything together in the church hoping that you're going to attract people here, that's a recipe for failure. It has to be kind of a both-and situation. So if you can learn the language of folks that are in your community, be able to penetrate that, have conversations, learn what their needs are, then ministries can emerge naturally in what your vision might be unfolding that will meet the needs of the community. So being able to communicate with people, being able to understand the challenges of the greater community, those are all things that you're going to have to be able to do as a church planter.
Mm-hmm. There were no others with Christ. He loved all people. And he loved the people that the religious folks were mortified that he was hanging out with. And so if you want to plant a church and you want it to be a vibrant, vital community of faith for people, you really need to just be 100% sold out in passion to be like Jesus, which means you meet people where they are, not where you think they need to be. And you let them fall in love with Jesus, because he'll do it. He'll I use the word, he sells himself. We don't need to sell him. We just need to show people what he looks like, because they're done with religion. And we get annoyed when we keep hearing about that, but it's true. And so I believe when people encounter an institution that doesn't look like an institution and is not so focused on rules and rigidity, and maybe it's about the message, and God does the rest. So I believe you just have to be sold out on figuring out how the people that are not already in the building, how they think and how they feel towards God and religion, and then you try to figure out how to offer them Christ so that they'll fall in love with Jesus. And you have to eat, breathe. That just has to consume you, because if you go into it thinking you've got it all figured out, it'll never work.
And how do we know if we're talking to a church planter or not? And part of that is educating other people about the kind of characteristics that we're looking for in others. Oftentimes our assessment is, well, this person seems like a pretty friendly individual and they were successful in their last church, so they'll probably be a good church planter. That's the worst assessment that you can make. Or they're extroverted. Some of the best church planters, like Adam Hamilton, are introverted. So I think being able to paint a picture for people of what a church planter type person might look like, so that becomes a lens through which they're looking through at the world, and when they're meeting others, be able to say, hey, have you ever considered this? And then be able to point them to some pretty quick assessment tools, self-assessment type things that won't cost any money, are very easy to do, and then gradually lead them deeper and deeper into assessment and discernment, but start at a surface level.
I think a lot of people look at church planting and they think, man, this is a glamorous thing, and I want to do that because you're cool if you're planting a church. But it is the most difficult work that you'll ever do in your life. So if somebody coming out of seminary came to me and said, I want to plant a church, I would tell them, make sure that they know what they're getting into. Because there was a stretch when we started the walk here back in 2007, where in that course of that year, I had 9 weeks. I worked over 100 hours a week. So you have got to know what you're getting yourself into if you're going to do this, and if you think you're going to be successful.
I would ask, first of all, the question, why? Tell me why. And I would go from there. If they articulate, I want to plant a church because I don't want to have to deal with all the stuff that my friends are dealing with in the existing churches that they're serving, and I think church planting is easier. I try and talk them out of it. And convince them that it's not easier, it's just different. But I'd want to know why. What's the motivating factor behind that?
If a young pastor with passion and energy said, what do you think? I'd want to know why. And I would just say, it's hard, be ready.
I would say, first of all, I would put the vision down on paper. I'd really draw it out and see if, the idea in your head or in your heart, how that really translates into something that's transferable, that you can share that with other people. And so that's probably where I would start with that individual. But again, I would look for those qualities within them as far as an evangelical urgency. Do they have the behavioral patterns in their life that match some urgency to reach people with the gospel message? Do they have some behavioral patterns that demonstrate an entrepreneurial spirit? Do they look at things and immediately see ways in which it can be improved, which it can be done differently or more effectively? And look for those kind of characteristics in that person.
I think for a church planter, especially a new church planter, there's so much required physically and emotionally in this process that when I say that person's got to stay close to God, I mean that person's got to stay really close to God. So you've got to be extremely disciplined about how you're developing your own and nurturing your own spiritual relationship. What does it mean in your life to be a fully devoted follower of Jesus? And how is your own reading of Scripture, not in sermon preparation or not in teaching preparation, but how is your own reading of Scripture shaping who you are as a Christian and as a pastor? And I think that we get so caught up in the glamour and the hype of doing something fresh and new that we forget to take care of ourselves spiritually and physically and mentally and emotionally. And I think for anybody to survive this coming out of the gate, that has got to be a number one priority.
When somebody interviewed me right before West launched as a campus, they said, how do you feel about being the pastor of a new faith community, that's a part of something else? And I said, this is like living out my dream to preach and offer Jesus. I always thought when I was finally able to be a pastor, there would be people. I wouldn't have to go find the people. There'd be some. I mean, maybe not many, maybe 10. But there'd be at least 10. And then they'd come back. And I realized very quickly, you got to go find the people.
I think the family of a planter needs to also, I'm not sure I'd use the word calling, but there has to be that sense of commitment on their part as well. If my wife, Kim, had said at any moment, I'm not doing this, I can't do this, it wouldn't have been a good thing to do, because it so taxes your relationship and it so involves the family that whether you want it to or not, it really is a family affair. So I think that kind of family system and support system becomes really important too.
It requires a lot of stamina. You have to take care of yourself spiritually. You have to remain close to God. You got to take care of yourself physically. I try to run 20 miles a week, even today. You've got to just look after yourself and your family in order to be able to survive this. It's not all glamour. You really have to understand your call. You really have to understand how God is speaking to you and what your gifts are, because it is a difficult road to hoe. But if this is what you're called to do, if this is what you're gifted to do, then there's no stopping you. And so I would just say, go for it.